Buenas tardes, bienvenidos a todos. My name is Martín Espada. Welcome to this conversation with Laurie and Guerrero about her book of poems, I Have Eaten the Rattlesnake. Laurie and Guerrero, born and raised in the south side of San Antonio, is the author of 4 poetry collections: Babies Under the Skin, Panhandler, 2008, A Tongue in the Mouth of the Dying, University of Notre Dame Press, 2013, A Crown for Gomicindo, Aztlán Libre Press, 2015, and I Have Eaten the Rattlesnake, new and selected, Texas Christian University Press, 2021. Her work has received various awards, including the 2007 Panhandler Chapbook Award, the 2012 Andres Montoya Poetry Prize from the Institute of Latino Studies at the University of Notre Dame, the 2016 Helen C. Smith Award for Poetry from the Texas Institute of Letters, and a 2014 International Latino Book Award. Other honors include grants from the Artist Foundation of San Antonio and the Alfredo Cisneros del Moral Foundation. She is an alum of Cantomundo. In 2014, Guerrero was appointed Poet Laureate of San Antonio. In 2015, she was appointed the Poet Laureate of the state of Texas. She holds a BA in English Language and Literature from Smith College and an MFA in Poetry from Drew University. Guerrero is a writer-in-residence at Texas A&M University, San Antonio. I wrote the introduction to this book. To quote from that introduction, Laurie Guerrero's poems weave a narrative of suffering and resistance to suffering in her family and the Mexican-American community of San Antonio. She pares the skin from the backbone of that suffering with a knife made of words. Take that visceral title, I Have Eaten a Rattlesnake. This title harkens back to the first poem in the book, On Eating Rattlesnake, and the last line of the book as well. Those circles, those echoes of resilience, surviving in spite of repeated losses and traumas, flourishing as a Mexican-American, a woman, a mother, a poet who embraces and yet transcends these multiple identities, refusing to be boxed in. How history trails behind her everywhere, made manifest in the ghosts of grandparents picking cotton in 1943, their cotton sacks 12 feet long and dragging behind like a tongue. Tongue does not speak. Her grandfather remembered the terror of lynching. Small wonder then that he was silent like every man after him. Listen to that silence. And listen, the poet did. Not only to tell her grandfather's story, but also to grieve for him in an extraordinary crown of sonnets. The mountain chain running through the heart of this book is the crown of sonnets for the poet's grandfather, called A Crown for Gomicindo. These are mournful, lyrical, surreal poems that linger in the mind's eye long after the book closes shut. Guerrero's nightmares become our own. The poems perform a critical function of the elegy to rescue the dead from oblivion. Guerrero trails this history behind her like a 12-foot sack jammed with cotton. She pushes history in front of her like her grandfather's coffin at the grocery. From all the racism, the grief, the trauma come not only healing, but tenderness. Letter to My Children About the Mouth teaches her son and her daughters how to kiss. This is the tender inheritance she bestows upon her children. Since tenderness is necessary but not sufficient in this world, Laurie Guerrero has written her own manifestos, declarations of principle, and poetics, telling us what it means to be an artist in a community under attack. Ars Politica, How to Make Art, is a blood-stirring poem where the poet calls upon a history of resistance. There is a second manifesto dedicated to the 300th anniversary of her beloved San Antonio. Here the poet invokes the power of her own warrior name, again calling on the ancestors in swirling, vivid language. Teach me, says the teacher. Indeed, the best teachers and the strongest poets know that we never stop learning from that struggle, so we can go on singing, shouting, whispering, and fighting. Listen to this poet. Please welcome Laurie and Guerrero.
Gracias, Martín. I had not heard you read the excerpt of the introduction like that, and hearing you say those things means so much to me, even though I've read them over and over and because they're part of the introduction of my book. But I'm so grateful for your presence in my life and for the years of conversation and for you taking the time to write this introduction and to be with me today. So thank you so much for that. I will jump in and read some poems, and I will say that this book is a collection of new and selected, and so there are poems from my first book, A Tongue in the Mouth of the Dying, and my second book, A Crown for Gomecindo. So I'll start with a poem. Actually, first I'm going to start with the first poem in the book, which is, as Martín said earlier, Uneating Rattlesnake. I remember it only once. I was small. Maybe it was the one my father shot off the front porch. Maybe it wasn't. The men stood around the fire. The women sat inside. I snaked around the men, hiding myself. Slitherer. I have seen it many times, the long stripping, one fist pulling skin, the other pulling flesh. And how the kills were celebrated. Rattles and skins hung like tapestries, the innards left to wild things. When it was passed around hot from the fire outside, the women did not partake. I dug in, rough and curious. There was nothing more unashamed than a rattler, no apology in its tongue. It would never be cute. I had to eat it. I had to know this. I'm going to read another, this one from my first book, A Tongue in the Mouth of the Dying. And the title is Sundays After Breakfast, A Lesson in Speech, but the title comes from the time after we had our barbacoa tacos and Big Red, and we would sit on the porch and my grandparents would tell stories, both sides of my grandparents. So this one's called Sundays After Breakfast, A Lesson in Speech. I should really have my glasses here. There were no names for men like that. Gringos who stitched up their rules, their white garb, laced snug the issues of the day. Lord didn't make us to mix with them folk, they said. But God's got nothing to do with the black boys dumped still alive into a restless river. God's got nothing to do with having to tell their mamas. That bloody water ran through each dark vein across Texas, fed the Gulf, all its brown-skinned people. This Grandpa could name. Los cuerpos, bodies swaying above the cotton like sheets on a line. No importaba que no eres negro, pero que no eres gringo. No, it didn't matter that you weren't black, Grandpa says, pushing himself from the table, but that you weren't white. He lived his life this way, silent like every man after him, opening his mouth only to eat, holding his head above the cotton between white men and black boys. Should I read another, Martín, or should we have a little conversation? Another, okay. I want to read, I have this, I won't read too many from the Crown of Sonnets, but there are 3 that I like to read. I think that give a good, a little taste of what this crown was for me. So I'll read 3. Stone fruit. Good, I would ask. Good enough, you'd say, of the wine we made from plums. Didn't we for years tend the mother tree? Didn't we for years prune, pluck, hold in our hands the purpled bodies bursting that begged, me next, have me? Weren't we so nourished in the nerve? Someone is buying our tree. You are reduced to pit. I put seed in dirt, wait for you to come back to me in a jar by the window. You are not growing, aren't you a plum? Little red, little kidney, little mouth singing, calling, I'm here, I'm here. I thought the dirt would give you something to take hold of. I've buried everything I've ever loved. Casketing. I've buried everything I've ever loved in the bone of reason. Now, even in dreams, you are dead. Sometimes I wheel your metal-colored coffin to the grocery store, once to a paperie, twice to Fiesta Bakery on Pleasanton. You are heavy. Once I was in high school in a play and parked you stage left. Always I shake you. Wake up, damn you. Sometimes the casket is open and I kick you. And when in my small shoes I make contact, your ribs crumble like the bark of an old mesquite. Wake up, wake up. We can't run the numbers. Argue, make your mother's bread if you are always going to be dead. Untouchable. If you are always going to be dead, who then will melt away the breasts from my chest? Need more my eyes than the unraveling of my hips. In your house, I was all bedrock and teeth, cutthroat, stopped clock, just as much man as woman or rain. You were blind and I loved you for it. In your house, my shoulders grew to fit the work. Patience blossomed upon my head, a crown. You were my mirror, my name, ready plum of my white hand, my ancient and rivered neck, my compass, my wing, my open gate, my warrior, my sleepless legion. As if I had been born male, my kingdom come. And one day in hot July, my kingdom gone. Oh, those are always hard to read. Should I keep on?
It's up to you. I'd like to hear more.
Okay. I'm going to read one that you mentioned here. Ars Politica. When I was poet laureate of the city, I often got this question in interviews and whatnot, asking me, you know, where do you find your inspiration? How do you do it? How do you write these poems? And it seemed very, I think you mentioned this earlier in your talk, Martín, about how, you know, you said poems were burning a hole in my pocket. And this idea of, it's such a need, such a necessity for me to write things down, but it's because I've been collecting things for so long, our histories, our fears that we've inherited, that we see every day in our homes and the homes that we grew up in. And so I decided to write this poem in a response to that question, in praise of the artists of San Antonio who already know. So this is Ars Politica, How to Make Art. You must start small, as our mothers were small, our fathers too small. In a pillowcase whip-stitched with roses or in an old coffee can, collect your abuelo's teeth. Assure them you will not bury them near the bones of the dog that froze the winter that dogs froze. Carry the teeth under your tongue. Let them root there. This is how you will learn to speak. Be ready to cough up songs. Corridos plucked first by a revolutionary whose gunsmoke you wear in your hair. The songs will be new in your throat. We are always beginning. We are always beginning again. You cannot be afraid to unhinge the jaw. Let the sun blister your mouth. No thirst. Cast your own eyes from their sockets like a confettied April, that you will know the bloom and the battle of flowers. Let your ribs draw across the ribs of another, el canto del violín. Let your fingers dance el guitarrón. Needle or pen, brushed oil, machete or drum, leather, cilantro, stomp. Be patient in the tooling. The weaving of experience 100, 500, 10,000 years to hear. Lovemaking in the cotton and nopal. Battle lines and color lines. Birding in the huts, in the casitas under a grove of mesquite and huizache. And two, lynchings and genocide and the feathery strands of our DNA that move our hands to do the work. Trust your hands know the work, even if you do not know the work. You do not speak for the dead. The dead speak for you. So I have another poem. These are this is another one of the new poems. It's called Uneating Rabbit. I remember it only once. I was small. I don't know where it came from, who skinned it, how it was caught, but that I had only ever held one in my hands. I was 4 and loved it despite its inability to love me back. I wanted and did not want to hold it. Such indifference in its eyes, its wanting to be left alone, unable to transform itself to wolf or lion. This is the way of the rabbit, little bunny, the misunderstood, misrepresented by fluff and cottontail. Its work had nothing to do with me, nothing to prove. The rabbit would rather die. I had to eat it. I had to know this. I will read one more from the new section. This one's called 1,000 Days After Death. And I'll say a lot of my poems have always come from dreams, and this is one of them. 1,000 Days After Death. I dream your small and decomposed body in my arms. When I glance down at your face, darkened and shriveled, I almost don't recognize you. Words do not occupy your mouth, no ideas in your hands. If there was a soul inside this brittle and stiff version of you, there is not one now. At times, I lay you down, break open the arms to wrap them around me. Other times, I change your clothes, the blue button down for the gray, so as to keep you presentable. The weight of your small head is familiar in the crook of my arm, and I love you as I love my own grown and fighting son, once small and noiseless in my arms. And when your face, leathered, knocks against my breast, I think of my lover's face, dark against my breast, how I love him with your wisdom, little dead thing. I do not need you to speak to me. It is enough that you are here still. It is enough that you choose me. It is enough that the only man who will not leave me is a dead one.
Muchas gracias. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. We have some questions already lining up. I have some questions that I want to ask first.
Okay.
And since I'm the moderator, I get to go first. Let's talk first about the sonnets for your grandfather. There are so many ways to write an elegy. There are so many ways to deal with death and grief in poetry. You chose the sonnet, the form associated in English with Shakespeare. Why did you do that?
It was there were a lot of reasons that led me to that, but I think my grandfather had a third grade education, and as I was learning, growing in my vocabulary and learning how to write things, my grandfather was also, so we were kind of learning at the same time. And he often said, I can't believe it. I can't believe I can't even barely write my name, and you're a writer. Now, I grew up on the same plot of land with my grandfather, who taught me to raise tomatoes and, build things. And I loved him because, as the only girl in that of my generation, he treated me like one of the boys, and I learned a lot from him. And that was probably the greatest thing he could have done for me. But because I was always doing things with him, and all the while him reciting stories of his childhood and his parents and tios and tias, I learned from him how to be resourceful in the land, how to use what we had, how he often used what he had, even his limited English. And so when he died, I thought about, I felt guilt, I think, in this education that I had, and having studied sonnets. And I said this the other day too in another talk, but I did my master's thesis on why people of color, women of color specifically, should not be writing sonnets. And I had to write, Russ Gay made me write it 6 times. But because I didn't feel like we should be using inherited forms, and we shouldn't be using a form that's known, that Shakespeare is known for. But after my grandfather passed, I thought I needed to utilize what I had the way my grandfather did. And I did know sonnets, and I had come to love them. And I felt that they were these small little poems, 14-line poems, were like a vessel that I could pour, that it would carry my grief for me. And as I moved along in the sonnets, I felt contained by them. And I needed that. I was such a mess after he passed. So there were so many reasons why. And I think that, as a Latina, it was really important for me to write in that form, specifically to honor a man who had a 3rd grade education, who picked cotton.
Yeah, no, that makes a great deal of sense. And you change the form by changing the subject. You write about this subject with this form. You're demanding respect and attention for the subject through the form. You subvert the form. and you honor the man. Let's talk about audience now. And one audience in particular, your children.
Oh.
How do you want these poems to serve as tools to teach your children about history or family or culture or tenderness?
I think that's probably why it's so important for me to be almost disgustingly honest in some of my poems, because I think, I hope I am constantly in a state of, well, wanting to be better, specifically because I have 3 children who they're not babies, they're older, but and that makes it even more difficult because they're older, that who are always watching me, who are always watching what I do, the decisions that I'm making, and the art that I'm creating, and they're all artists as well. And so, because I think as they got older, I think it became really important for me to address some of the things that I might not have, or maybe another person wouldn't. But in my work, I talk about the difficulty of growing up a little brown girl from a poor community, and the racism and the sexism and the classism that I endured as a girl, specifically the intersections of who I am, and the difficulty it is to raise a son, having known that, knowing what he will grow up to be, or what he will be surrounded by, or and then also with my daughters, knowing what I know. And so I try now to just be honest with the vulnerability that that exists because of who we are and where we're from and who we're from. And I don't know. I mean, I don't even know if that answers your question, Martín.
Yes, that absolutely does. This is a question that takes us in yet another direction, and maybe combines something at question 1, something at question 2. You confront a wide range of historical and personal grief and grievance in your work. When you write about such flammable subjects, how do you confront the craft? How do you edit yourself? How do you go beyond the anger and the pain in a poem like Brownies of the Southwest, Troop 704, to make it art, something beyond statement? A statement.
That's a hard question. I think, I mean, honestly, when I think about the kinds of experiences that I've had, I know that no matter what I've endured, my parents and my grandparents and my great-grandparents endured more. And so, always with that in mind, if I'm conscious of that, if I'm mindful of this when I'm ready to go into revision, after I've written everything out that I need to write, it makes it easy to sort of disassociate, because I know what I've experienced is nothing compared to what they have. And so it makes it easy. It's almost, I mean, not totally easy, but it makes it bearable in that everything that they endured has led me to where I am a writer now. And now it's my job to craft it. And I come from craftspeople. Mine happens to be poetry. So in order to stand in this line that I come from, like, I have to, I mean, I don't have a choice. That's my job. So I feel like it's not as hard as some might imagine. I don't know. I don't know.
Okay. Now I'm going to ask you a really tough question.
Great.
It's the influence question.
Hmm.
But it's about live influences, not canonical influences.
Mm.
So, who were the living flesh and blood poets you met or heard or read that made you believe you could do this poetry thing too? Who are the poets we've all heard of that you would recommend, or are the poets most of us have never heard about that you would recommend? Take part one of the question first.
Okay. Well,
Living flesh and blood poets.
well, I mean, I think of, gosh, Martín, that is a hard one. There's, I mean, I was most influenced immediately. The first living writer, she's a poet also, but known more as a fiction. But the first living writer that made me feel like I could do this was Sandra Cisneros. And you know, like many other writers, she's influenced many. But it wasn't necessarily the stories she was telling or the ways in which she was telling them. I remember having a copy of The House on Mango Street when I was 11 years old, and in the back it had her bio. And one of the last lines, or if not the last line of her bio, said she lives in San Antonio, Texas. Right. So I was like, well, then I can, you know, that alone, that line in her bio made me, that was it. Of course, I was not at the time reading. I was reading Sylvia Plath and Shakespeare, and but it wasn't until, you know, as I got older and was studying more. I mean, people whose work I love is Ross Gay, Aracelis Germay, Patrick Rosal, Martín. Your work has always been an influence to me, always, and it's that sense of being present in the right here, right now, and telling the stories that are happening right here, right now, whether they are public or private. That, you know, the equal importance of those stories, our stories. But I also love one of my favorite writers. One of my contemporaries is Paul Lopez out of San Diego. His work is phenomenal. Also Carmen Jimenez Smith, she's amazing. I'm just, yeah, I mean, there's so many. There's so many.
That was the right answer.
Thanks. I win.
Yes. I see a couple of questions from the audience. That's where we're going to turn next. First, we have a short question and then a somewhat more complex question. It's a question from Stephen Soros, the rabbit poem. Can you talk about why you presented it as a prose poem?
Yeah, so the poem Uneating Rabbit and its sister poem Uneating Rattlesnake, both are prose poems, and so there's these little blocks of text. And I think it was important for me to write it in that way because when I think about these specific moments, these memories that I have, I think of the land that I grew up on, and just literally the dense earth that I was running around in barefoot, you know, snaking around, you know, out in the dirt. And so to me, that was the only way. It was a hard, it feels like a hard chunk of earth, or a hard chunk of the reality of my childhood. And so that was really important for me to present it in a way that gives that sense or that feeling. Thank you for that question.
Another question comes from Aaron Oliver, is preceded by a statement. One of Guerrero's themes is of finding and giving voice and agency, and the importance of honoring one's own authenticity so that she may also give voice to others. I'm curious if she could speak to the development of agency, to finding one's own voice, to honoring our
Martín, we
narrative.
lost you.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Okay.
Okay.
I'm going to read the question and then I'll answer it. Martín, you're frozen. One of Guerrero's themes is of finding, giving voice, and oh, Martín, you're back.
Okay, I'm back. I don't know where I went since I was always here.
I'm sorry. Okay, I
Okay.
lost you then.
All right. Can you hear me now? Can everyone hear?
Yes, yes. I'm just
good.
I'm reading the question now.
Yeah. All right.
Okay. She says, I'm curious if she could speak to the development of agency, to finding one's own voice, to honoring our narratives. I'm curious what in the way of practices, disciplines, or other habits she suggests that others develop to discover their own authentic selves. Wow, that's a heavy question. But I think for me, I mean, I can only speak for myself and my own experience, but one of the things that I learned to do very young, and could not articulate it then, but because I grew up with my grandfather, paying attention, just really paying attention to the things around us. And for me, with him, it was paying attention to how the tomatoes were growing and, you know, how the birds sang their song. And I think that sense of, I think that we're so overwhelmed right now with social media and all the things. And it has been really important for me the last couple of years, getting off social media, getting back to my writing, but essentially getting back to paying attention what's around me, what's not in a screen, and really learning to listen again to the birds and feel the earth again the way I did when I was a kid, and this moving away from social media specifically and just the internet. It forced me to go back to this time of hearing, where I was able to hear my own voice. And before social media, when I started writing, when I was, you know, a little girl, I didn't have those things to distract me. I didn't have other people's voices in my head. And so I think it's really, really important to do that as a first step, to remember to listen to your own voice and to get rid of everything else that you don't need in your head. So I'll leave it at that.
No, it's very reminiscent of something Marge Piercy says in the poem "The Art of Blessing the Day." Attention is love. That's in essence the same idea, I think. Yeah. Are there any other questions from the audience? Okay, we're going to see if any more questions come in from the audience. While we're waiting to see if there are any other questions, there are about 5 minutes left in our session. Here's another question I would like to ask you. And earlier, when you talked about your decision not to write sonnets, followed by your reversal of that decision, with dramatic results, I might add, it made me think of this. Are there poems you couldn't write 10 years ago that you could write now? Are there poems you can't write now that you think you'll be able to write in 10 years?
I love this idea. yes and yes. I think as you get older, I think there's, 10 years ago, I had not experienced loss. I had not known the rawness that I have known. And 10 years ago, I didn't have to fight myself often for the ability to hear my own voice. I didn't have to, I mean, yeah. I mean, I think knowing that with time comes experience, and you don't know that. I mean, you hear that, but you don't know that until you know that. And I think the kind of grief that I have known now prepares me for what's coming. So I'm stronger now, and I know that I will probably also know a kind of joy I haven't known yet. So I look forward to what I will be writing in 10 years. I have no idea. But I know that I will be writing because I know that I have to write. I have to write. That Martín, you made me cry.
Well, I am sure that you have in your writing about grief, you have consoled others. And one of the ironies of writing your own grief is that sometimes it doesn't necessarily console you. Rest assured, you've
That's
consoled
true.
others.
Well, thank you.
I think we can
appreciate that.
Yeah, I think we have time for one more question before the end of the session. And it comes once again from Stephen.
I'm sorry, I just wanted,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Oh, there was the one last poem that I wanted to read, if I could do that.
Okay, if you'd rather close with a poem, that would be fine. We have one more question on deck, but we have one more question, but if you'd rather close with a poem, you can certainly close with a poem.
Okay, I'm sorry. I don't know. Should we do the question? We should do the question.
You can give a really quick answer to the question.
Okay, let's do that.
All right, Stephen Soros again. Since consciousness consists to a large degree of other people's voices in our heads, internalized, how is it possible to just get rid of those voices?
I think that's everybody's own journey to figure that out. And I think for me specifically, it was getting away from internet, getting away from voices that didn't need to be living present, voices that didn't need to be in my life. It was a various things, but I think that's individual, and I think that's something that your body tells you, and I think that's when you listen to your body.
Okay.
So I'll close up with this poem.
Okay, thank you, Laurie and Guerrero. And by the way, thank you to Karen Creech for doing the tech backstage and helping us present ourselves to you this afternoon, the San Antonio Book Festival. Marianne, take it away.
This last one is called The Plight of Lovers. You came to my body in my wildest grief. Drunk in it, I welcomed you. There were catastrophes I needed to explore. You contained them all. When you lap the well of my blood, milky and flowing near the river and sugarcane fields, you drink too, my mother, and her mother, and hers, and the lovers each they had. This is the dowry. This is the lot. The only child I will give you is myself. Be worthy. I have eaten the rattlesnake. Thank you again, Martín. Thank you, everybody, for attending. I'm so grateful.
Buy this book. Muchas gracias.
Gracias.